Okay, so in this mini lecture, I'm going to explain why the wedding by Jeff Bezos killed at least 2 people. So we know from media sources that 96 private jets landed in Venice in relation with the wedding. And we know that we know the identity, and we can infer the departure point for 34 of these private jets. And in particular, we know that 15 traveled from California and 7 from New York City and 5 from Miami. And of course, these people could not be asked to travel together in the same private jet. That would have been too much. So they actually took 15 different private jets to travel from California to Venice. So basically we have to compute the overall distance traveled to get to Venice. But first of all, let's remember one important parameter. So that's 4.9 kilogram per mile. So that's the amount of CO2, the average amount of CO2 per mile that has been emitted. So if we compute the total distance of these 34 private jets that we know the route of, and if we assume that the remaining 62 private jets basically covered proportionally the same distance, then we come up with this number. So that's the staggering 935,474 miles. So that's the total distance that was traveled by private jet in order to get to Venice, right? So now what do we have to do to compute emissions? So we have to multiply this number by this number, and we have to do another important thing, because it is something that some people neglect, but the fact that these emissions occur at a relatively high altitude means that we have to multiply basically this amount of emissions by a coefficient which is 1.9. So this is the so-called radiating forcing coefficient due to flying, because flying produces a contrail, produces other effects that create additional greenhouse effect. So if we multiply these 3 numbers, we come up with the total amount of emissions produced by the private jets. So that's 8,709 tons of CO2. Okay, so that was the total emissions due to private jets. And just to give you a reference, the amount of emissions produced by the average person in the world is 6 tons per year. Okay, so remember this coefficient, we're going to use it later. So that is the average emissions of CO2 by the average citizen in the world. Okay, we're going to use this later. And let's go back to private jets just for a minor caveat. So actually this is most likely an underestimation of the total amount of emissions produced, because the private jets that traveled from California had to do a stopover on the East Coast in order to refuel, and many private jets have to do the so-called empty leg flights. So they have to travel without any passenger to pick up the passengers that then are transported. So this is likely a massive underestimation of the actual amount of emissions that was produced. Okay, so that's the number 1 source of emission, but there is another very important source of emission that is due to yacht. Because again, due to media report, we know that Jeff Bezos and some other guests probably thought that they had to recover from the fatigue of the flight. A flight from Los Angeles to Venice probably takes at least 13 hours. So they spent at least 7 days cruising around the Mediterranean. Okay, and in particular, Jeff Bezos has a super mega yacht that is called Koru. And if we assume that this mega yacht cruised for 8 hours every day and then stayed docked for the remaining 16 hours, so we can estimate that this yacht produced 21 tons of CO2 per day. Okay, so that's yacht, the second source of emissions. Okay, so if we assume that Jeff Bezos stayed on the yacht at least 7 days, this is what the media report says, and if we assume that 9 other guests made the same experience, so we end up with a total of 1,500 tons of CO2 produced by yacht. Okay, so that's the second major source of emission. And then we have a third one that is very, very small, and it is a helicopter. So helicopter, traveling by helicopter, because these people were to be flown from the private jet from the yacht where they were staying to Venice. So these helicopter produced just 3.34 tons of CO2. Okay, so we have these 3 sources of emission. Then I don't want to take into account the amount of emissions for the food, for the hotels, etc., because in the end, I mean, probably they would have done maybe the same at their place of residence. So if we sum up these 3 sources of emissions, then we end up with a grand total of 10,213 tons of CO2. So that's the total amount of emissions that we can estimate was emitted. Again, it's an underestimation, but it gives us a number. So the first thing that we can do is to consider how many people in the world would produce the same amount of emissions during a year. And that's very easy. We just need to divide this number by 6. Okay, so this divided by 6. So that is equal to 1,547 people. So basically, Jeff Bezos for this wedding emitted as much CO2 as the amount emitted by 1,547 people in the world in a year. But the one thing that interests me the most is really the mortality impact of this wedding. And here we have a very interesting article by Daniel Bressler, published in Nature Communications in 2021. He estimates the number of tons of CO2 that are responsible to kill one person. This coefficient is 4,434. So this means that there will be one death for every 4,434 tons of CO2 that is being emitted. This is, again, an underestimation, because this number is obtained only looking at excess deaths due to heat waves, so it doesn't take into account the mortality impact of other extreme weather events. But let's keep this into account. And of course, this is obtained under one specific scenario. I think it's scenario 3.4 of the IPCC report. Some scenarios are worse, some scenarios are better, but I think this is interesting because it's a kind of central estimate of the mortality impact of emissions. So we just need to divide the grand total, 10,000 to 10,213 by 4,434, and this is 2.3 people. So we can estimate that the wedding killed 2.3 people from here up to 2,100. So yeah, that's I would say the dire statistics of CO2 emissions. And yeah, we will never have to forget that CO2 emissions kill.